Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susana Suisuiki. Coming up.
We know that living in a foreign land is going to be hard for the kids to continue to speak the language.
Aotearoa celebrates Kiribati Language Week. Also,
many of the settlements have been there for very long periods of time, almost going back to World War II.
There's a growing need for more residential land in PNG, and a new podcast looks at reducing stigma around mental health for Samoans. Events are being held across Aotearoa this week to celebrate Kiribati Language Week. This year's theme is Thriving and Flourishing our Kiribati language, culture and knowledge build i-Kiribati resilience and prosperity. Moira Tulei Patela was at an event in Porirua and has this report.
As with most Pacific gatherings, an event is opened with a prayer to give thanks and blessings, which was then followed by a few performances from the younger members of the community. Regina Te Marawa Kapiri Era, a New Zealand-born i-Kiribati, says the highlight for her is seeing the community come together.
There's more of us than you think. Yeah, that's what's like shocked to me. I was shocked to see that there was more than what I thought, how many there was of us in this community. I thought there was 10, but there's way more than that.
She says it's also great to see the elders of the community help teach the language to younger people. Tūman Tōmata has been in Aotearoa since 1974. She says there were no i-Kiribati when she arrived, and it was hard to maintain the language.
And when I came, I nearly lost the language because there's no Kiribati in Porirua to communicate with. So I started to learn my husband's language. So I speak only English and Niuan language and no Kiribati.
Mrs. Tōmata says she met a few i-Kiribati students years later and discovered there were some words she had forgotten.
They always laugh at me and say, you say that word, but it's not a Kiribati word. It was a Niue word. So it was a bit of a shame, and I said, oh, sorry, because when I speak in Kiribati, I mix the language all together. And that's the thing that is so important to me, that I need to really stick to the language.
Mrs. Tōmata says her language journey now includes teaching her children and grandchildren. Sailosa Tuenyo Sia describes what this week means for her community.
We see this week every year as an opportunity for us to kind of look at what we need to do to maintain our language and our culture as our identity being in New Zealand.
She says while there are challenges in maintaining the language and culture in Aotearoa, it's a challenge the community is willing to overcome.
We're so proud of our language, and this Language Week encourages and to promote our language and our culture to our young generation, because we know that living in a foreign land is going to be hard for the kids to continue to speak the language, to write, and to practice the culture.
Sailosa Tuen Yosia says their families and the government back in Kiribati support the Language Week by sending through music and stories.
Papua New Guinea's Institute of National Affairs says the government must ensure that land is available for people to live on. It's a feature of life in PNG that tens of thousands of people live illegally as squatters on the fringes of the country's cities. Residents of one of the largest settlements in Port Moresby, Bushwara, are facing the threat of being forcibly moved as the owner of the site plans to build a new suburb there. Don Wiseman spoke with the Executive Director of the Institute of National Affairs, Paul Barker, about this latest settlement clearance and others that are likely.
All around the vicinity of Moresby, there are legitimate landlords and a whole host who have received their land through rather less legitimate means. Number One Super certainly has legitimate title. Some of the others, as I say, have far less credible title. It's certainly tough, but it highlights a much bigger issue, which is that the Prime Minister makes statements, for example, saying that, look, you've got to make sure that you've got proper title to land where you're going to go and live. But the reality is, who provides the land? In NCD, it's the same in all other towns and cities across the country, according to the Lands Department. There is totally inadequate land, state land, made available for the growing populations. So you inevitably are ending up with settlements. Many of the settlements have been there for very long periods of time, almost going back to World War II. And they're being relocated for new developments, as I say, often with less than legitimate land acquisitions by some of the new buyers. But in the case of NSL, well, yes, they do have a long established title, and people who were putting up houses there were given warnings. But yes, it is very challenging. And the settlements are a very large proportion of the entire population, and they are housing a large portion of the formal workforce as well as the informal workforce. So you're having people in the professions, lawyers, accountants, government workers, policemen, all on these settlement lands. And some of them have put very large sums of money into developing their houses. And then sometimes those are destroyed at very short notice. And we're understanding that there are a variety of other major demolitions that are being planned by other landlords around the place. Alternative arrangements could and should be made. I mean, when the city authorities have instigated or sometimes endorsed various settlements, there have been all these promises of, we'll replace your land with somewhere else where you can settle more suitably. But the reality is that that doesn't usually materialize. It's also, in many cases, the settlements are going on customary land, and customary landowners are reaching tentative arrangements with the settlers, which the settlers then think are actually legitimate, but then the customary landowners think, well, hang on, we've got other ideas, or we've got better deals, or whatever. So the onus is on government to enable both the customary landowners to legitimately trade their land if they so choose, for long-term leases, adequate for settlers to actually be able to commit to building and maybe reselling properties over the course of time, but also for the state to acquire land legitimately and, of course, to allocate land through legitimate means, which means going through proper land board hearings or proper processes. And unfortunately, some of these land allocations are going through, in recent years, through direct grant arrangements or allocations exempt from advertising, often allocated to persons with special influence.
Is it common then that these people, squatters or settlers or whatever you call them, are they paying rent for this land at all?
In many cases, they are paying rent, or they've paid for the land to someone. There are people who trade land to others. And as I say, with customary landowners, they do sell the land on some basis to settlers. And so vast areas of customary land, these are all direct deals between customary landowners and settlers, but they haven't really got legitimate legal title. And various players are saying, including the new member for Hiri, is saying, look, we have to establish a mechanism so that customary landowners can actually lease out on a long-term basis their land, maintain the land title for themselves as the customary landowners, but nevertheless make it available if and where they wish on a long-term basis to settlers who can also then trade their properties or have the security of tenure to actually invest in those properties and really improve them. There are real issues with the city, because the city also would like to make sure that they get in first and install the necessary basic infrastructure. But of course, they move at a very slow pace.
What's the possibility of the owners and the squatters coming to an arrangement where the lots are surveyed and they buy the lot that they're living on? I understand that's actually happened in some parts of the Pacific.
Yeah, all kinds of special arrangements really could be made. And obviously those who who've got title, like superannuation funds, and others who have legitimate title, want to safeguard their title and ensure that it's not encroached upon. But there are opportunities for them to work out arrangements which could safeguard the interests of both parties, ensure the safeguarding of the title and the proper development of their estates, but at the same time reaching arrangements with other parties for, including maybe with some of the parties that are already on the land. But of course, it's an area that's fraught with risks, but nevertheless, we have to recognize that the state has a major responsibility to make sure that land, by one means or another, is able to be available legitimately.
An expert in Melanesian politics says Vanuatu's first ever foreign policy paper raises its profile in the midst of the US and China competing for influence in the Pacific. Griffith University professor Tess Newton-Kane says the paper has been a decade in the making. Koroi Hawkins spoke with Ms. Newton-Kane and began by asking why it has taken so long to produce.
As in all countries, I mean, it's the same in New Zealand, it's the same here in Australia. You know, when it comes to elections and what's top of mind for voters, foreign policy is not really it. People are more concerned about things that affect them at home, you know, cost of living, education, health, all of those sorts of things. So I think that's one issue. There's been no kind of demand for it from the electorate as such. I think also, you know, it kind of needs to be something that is obviously informed by political party platforms, but is something that everyone can kind of sign up to. It needs to be something that isn't just for now, that's then going to be thrown out and disregarded and completely rewritten by whoever comes in next. I think that applies in all countries, but particularly in a country like Vanuatu, where there are quite frequent changes of government.
I was actually going to ask that question a bit later, but since you brought it up, where does this document exist in that setting? Is it sort of for the ministry as a guideline, and the changes of government that you mentioned, will they affect it? Will it be amended, do you think?
I mean, it's described as a living document, so obviously there's scope to keep it under review and to adjust it as necessary. I don't think it's something that's going to be reviewed and rewritten on a very regular basis. I think it's more of a guideline. It's a policy document rather than legislation, so it doesn't create any legal obligations or requirements on the part of particular ministries or agencies. I think it's more to kind of be a guideline. I also think it's kind of a way of demonstrating to the outside world that Vanuatu has done some thinking about this and that Vanuatu has some particular positions on this, and here they are in one document. So if you want to know what does Vanuatu think about foreign policy or geostrategic competition or trade, we can now just point to that and say, well, here it is. Here is the most recent comprehensive statement of what Vanuatu's position on these issues is.
Looking at that detail, you've obviously had a look at this document. Any standouts for you?
It struck me as a very Vanuatu document. So there were some key things that were stated and restated that make it very clear that this is a Vanuatu document. One was, there's the numerous references to Vanuatu's position as a member of the non-aligned movement. I was in Vanuatu recently, and a member of the government described Vanuatu as being staunchly non-aligned. So that is something that Vanuatu holds very dear and is very much a foundation stone of this type of thinking and the foreign policy work. The other was several references to the issue of the border dispute with France over Matthew and Hunter, which are the southernmost islands claimed by Vanuatu. That's obviously a significant issue on a number of fronts, including the diplomatic relationship with France, the delimitation of Vanuatu's EEZ, all of those things come into play, but it was mentioned 2 or 3 times. Carver diplomacy gets a mention in one of the preamble documents. So there are a few little nuggets throughout there that really give it a very strong Vanuatu flavour.
The US and China geopolitical competition in the region, I saw a line unwillingly thrust into this in the foreword. Your thoughts on their positions?
Yeah, I noticed those words as well, and I think they're significant, and I think they do kind of sum up how people in Vanuatu and elsewhere in the region feel about this, that this was not a competition of their making. They have been unwillingly thrust or dragged into it. And I think, having to have things like a foreign policy document, a national security strategy, be involved in these conversations is a reflection of that. I think by making this document very much their own and highlighting what their values are, what their interests are, what their resource constraints are, it will hopefully help Vanuatu be able to massage and finesse those conversations with partners to keep them very much focused on, we need to keep our interests forefront for us. We don't have the time, the resources, or the energy to be worrying about your interests. We need to focus on our interests.
In that vein, it also points out the opportunity for leverage, I guess, of the different players in the region, which is something we've seen quite prominently. It's kind of mentioned in this document, and it's we sort of knew this, but to see it in writing is quite useful.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, why, I don't see that there's any problem with that. Vanuatu understands this as well as anybody else. It's not something that's new for countries like Vanuatu. They've been in this kind of position before, during the Cold War, during the, previous checkbook diplomacy competition between Taiwan and China. So they know that whilst that this does present an opportunity, I think they also realise, and I think this is reflected in the document, possibly not as explicitly, but there are some implicit references to the burden that it places on countries like Vanuatu in having to manage a multiplicity of relationships, in having to be aware of this competition, so that, being aware of how engagement with this country might affect the perceptions of another country, and I think that's all kind of in there in the mix as well.
A nursing lecturer is hoping to break down stigma surrounding mental health for Samoans through a new podcast, Whaungangana. Presented in Ngangana Samoa, or the Samoan language, the podcast is mainly aimed at Samoan migrants in New Zealand, exploring how mental health is interpreted from a Samoan viewpoint, based on cultural practices and values, and how to manage mental well-being. I spoke with Dr. Ioana Mulipola and began by asking her how the idea for the podcast came about.
Well, I think it's an accumulation of my years of experience working in clinical practice. What I observe and my experience working with our people in clinical practice, that's when I identify or I observe there's a great need for language, understanding the language. And I think what I mean by language, because Samoa, we have different interpretation of what mental illness and mental health is, with the westernized way of looking at mental health. So it's a combination of that, and also the idea of creating this podcast is because it's from the findings of my doctorate that I did in 2022-23. So the idea was already there from my clinical experience, and then during my doctorate study, that's when I definitely, it's something that I really think that I really want to do a podcast, just to take the message out there, to share what I know, my knowledge about what mental health and what is really the experience in mental health. I want to share it with my community in a language that everyone can understand.
Does Samoan culture prioritize mental well-being? If so, how?
No, I think the mental well-being, it's in Samoa, health and well-being, that's something that is very central to who we are as Samoan, because it's our way of life. It's because we prioritize that in everything we do. Like if we do things in the village, within our family, within the Matai system, with every system that we participate in Samoa within our family, it's all centralized in health and well-being. Everything we do, our relationship with other people, it's everything we do. That's because we prioritize our health and well-being by having good connection with others. So it's something that is really centralized with us. But I think what I mean about different interpretation is because when we talk about mental illness from our Samoan perspective, we related that to our culture and our beliefs that mental illness in Samoa, it's because people believe that it's because we are not meeting we are not having good relationship with others, with the environment, with everyone.
What are you hoping to achieve with your podcast? Have you received any feedback so far?
So far, because it's just released on Monday this week. So far, what I can see from here, not so much of the feedback. I think it's too early for feedbacks, but I think there's a lot, the building up of the downloads of the sessions. So I think for me, what I'm hoping to get out of this is I really want to empower the communities, the Samoan community, because mental health is a topic that we hardly talk about. And I think what I wanted to start, I want to start the conversation that it's okay to talk about mental health, because I always believe in this, that there is no health without mental health, and it's something that we need to talk about, and we need to normalize it. Like, we need to talk about it, that everybody is affected by mental health in any shape or form, and people respond to mental health situation differently. So we need to talk about it and normalize it, and then we need to support each other. And then it's more of addressing stigma, that it's a topic that we need to talk about it. It's okay to talk about it. So that's what I'm hoping to get out of this. So I really want my community, the Samoan community, to have an idea, so for them to have a knowledge about what mental health is and what mental illness is and what are the symptoms, so that people will look after their own health and well-being, and their families and their community. That's what I'm hoping to get out of this.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, Tōwha Suifua.